Buongiorno, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak in English, although I'm Italian. It's my very pleasure to be here again at the International Journalist Festival in Perugia. I will spend just about 20 seconds to introduce myself. I am Philippe Di Salvo. I'm a journalist and a researcher based at the Insitute of Media and Journalism at the Università della Svizzera Italiana, which we can translate into the University of the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, which I assure you is a thing. And I do research in journalism and relationship between the news and the hacking sphere, and as a journalist, I write mainly for the Italian Wired magazine and some other publications. I'm here not as a moderator, rather as a facilitator of a conversation with Professor Bill Dutton. Here on my right is one of the most prominent scholars from internet studies and research about the internet and the uses of internet at large, and he's a senior fellow, a member of the advisory board at the Oxford Internet Institute, and an Oxford Martin Fellow at the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center, and a visiting professor at the School of Media and Information at the University of Leeds. Until 2018, he was the Kellogg Professor of Media and Information Policy at Michigan State University, and the director of the Kellogg Center. He's the author of some of the most important books and publications about the internet, including the Oxford Handbook of Internet Studies, published in 2013. And recently, he has been doing new research about the use of the internet and how people use the internet to access information, news, and other informational content online. And today we're going to discuss with him some of the things that we have been hearing in the past 2 years about the internet and things that happen also on the internet. And just to give you some context, this morning we were discussing how to organize this talk. I will read you some headlines that have been published in the past 2 years. So, for instance, Democracy Disrupted from the New York Times, 2017. Your echo chamber is destroying democracy, Wired, America, 2016. Is social media destroying democracy? This time as a question, so it is more an open field, for Newsweek, 2016. And fake news could destroy Western society, State Department official warns, Yahoo News, 2018. And probably my favorite, can Mark Zuckerberg fix Facebook before he breaks democracy? Again, with a question mark, at least. New Yorker, 2018. So we're here to talk about whether these are myths, whether democracy is really in danger because of the internet, and to discuss together with Bill what is the state of the art of research at the moment, and what are your specific results from your most recent work. So just to open this, was it really a shift in the public discourse about the internet in the past 2 years after the fake news debate in particular and the Cambridge Analytica case? And what has changed compared to 2011, for instance, where the headlines were Facebook and Twitter helped the explosion of the Arab Spring and democratization of North Africa? So what has changed in your opinion?
Well, thank you, Pierre. And by the way, it's wonderful to be here. This is an incredible conference. It's unlike any social science conference, so I think we should have a lot to learn from the way you've organized this. Yes, dramatic changes, of course. I mean, early on, the internet was assumed to be irrelevant to politics because so few people use the internet and so forth. But again, like many technologies, discussion of the internet and democracy goes from utopian to dystopian views quickly. And certainly it was, during the Arab Spring, there was a utopian sense of the internet bringing democracy to the world. And we, of course, researchers looked at that, questioned that repeatedly. But after that, actually, it was a very interesting period of time in which the internet was no particular importance. right? It was very few people looked at the internet at all because everybody used it. It's like the telephone. Let's not. It makes no particular difference. And then 2016 happened, and the U.S. presidential election, the Brexit elections, and events around Cambridge Analytica and other events. It was even right in the midst of the 2016 election, the internet and Facebook was perceived as a positive thing because it gave better information about who supported whom and what districts and so forth. But it eventually became a very dystopian view that Trump's election, Brexit, some elections, and the rise of some political parties across Europe were partly, if not completely, a function of misinformation and echo chambers and filter bubbles, and that it was distorting the information base upon which the public makes decisions. And of course, forever, democracy is based upon well-informed citizens. In the 1940s, we worried about broadcasting and propaganda on broadcasting, and now it's the social media and the internet becoming so ubiquitous. Half the world online, or more than half the world online now, 4 billion users. The potential of the internet distorting information created panic over misinformation, panic over echo chambers, the idea that people cocoon themselves with like-minded people and reinforced by the internet, and filter bubbles, the fact that while we enjoy personalization of the internet, we are inadvertently personalizing ourselves. That is putting ourselves in a filter bubble where we just simply hear from like-minded people. The panic about that was huge, and in particular, even people at Google were wondering what's going on here, and they had this question: is this valid? What should we be thinking about? They actually put together a proposal for research on what the filter bubble, whether search and in the internet and social media were undermining in the information base for information about politics. And I put together a group that competed with other groups internationally for some grant support to look at that, and that led to the research that I'll talk about today.
And I would like to quote you from an article you published on The Conversation this year in 2019, where you wrote that these concerns, so disinformation, fake news, echo chambers, and everything that you mention now, are much discussed, but have not yet been thoroughly studied. So my question would be, before we start looking at your results, is at what point is now research? How much research is available about these issues, and are really academics and researchers being heard by policymakers and politicians and journalists whatsoever?
Yeah. Well, we did a review of literature for this study that we were supported, and there has been research, but the problem with most of the research done on filter bubbles and echo chambers is that it's all been done on the production of news. So single platform studies, for example, using Twitter, wondering if personalization of Twitter on Twitter will lead people to have sort of be caught in a filter bubble and so forth. Very little research has been done on users. That is, how do people use the internet and how do people get information about politics in a context which is rich with social media and internet use. So our research was one of the first, and I think it was the first major study that had a user orientation, a focus on internet users rather than a single platform. And I think that led us to insights that cannot be looked at when you simply study the production of news on a single platform. And just to be clear, there's no question that people do produce fake news or the F word or disinformation. And there occasionally personalization does work in some ways. I don't think it works as we tried to train the internet that we were different ideological parties, and we couldn't do it. But personalization sometimes works. And if you want to order a local pizza, for example. But very, very seldom do people look at to what degree users conform to the ideas of a filter bubble, or echo chambers. And that's the first thing we did that was different from previous research.
Okay, so we are referring here to our forthcoming book chapter titled "The Internet and Access to Information About Politics: Searching Through Filter Bubbles, Echo Chambers, and Disinformation," which is your forthcoming piece of research. So we will now go through some of the results that emerge from the article, and I think we can really start going through some of the points. And can you describe this study? What was your methodology, and what you actually did to study how people consume the news on the internet?
Yeah, well, I'll keep it very brief because and I'm happy to answer questions that you may have about the particular methodology, but we essentially used a web-based internet survey where we purchased email lists from 7 nations. So we conducted a survey of 14,000 internet users in 7 countries, about 2,000 people in each country, including Italy. And we basically, our countries were the US as a comparator, but in 6 European countries: Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Spain. And in each of those countries, the sample was stratified so that it was relatively as close to representative of the general population of internet users as possible. And we were asking about how they used, what kinds of media they used, and how to get information about politics. And almost all our findings are based on that survey. But we also did trace data studies and, of course, the literature review. And so we did complementary studies, but the core research was that survey.
And there is something that emerged from your chapter, and is the existence of various forms of determinism. So the idea that technology is the cause or the goal of certain social activities. And do you think that was the approach on which most of these debates have been conducted? And why is it wrong in your view?
Yeah. Well, I think actually the history of internet and technology research is often based upon technologically deterministic theories. People look at the features of a technology and extrapolate from that how it will affect individuals. So if you think of the easiest, the filter bubble, the idea that if people personalize search, so that if machine learning and algorithms lead people to ensure that they get the kinds of information they want, that it will put somebody in a filter bubble. That is, they'll get liberal or conservative or partisan information that fits and conforms with their particular personal preferences. And so that, and somehow people will accept that and not question that or what have you. So that's kind of a technologically deterministic hypothesis based upon the features of the technology. The echo chamber is similar to that search puts you in place of certain kinds of information, but that also it's a social determinism that people will try to cocoon themselves with other people, like-minded people, and they'll throw people out of their network if they disagree with them on politics, or they'll cull their networks so that they have like-minded people to share their views with. So these are deterministic either from a technological point of view or socially deterministic view. And the history of research on technology, and particularly communication technologies, suggests that we're often wrong because that's why there's so many factors that shape the way people use technology: cultural, economic, social, political, and so forth, that you really have to look empirically at how people actually use technology and see to what degree that this conforms with some of these particular notions. The panic was based upon a technologically deterministic view anchored in research on the production of media on single platforms. And we're looking at this empirically, what actually happens by looking at how users deal with multiple platforms and multiple sources of information.
And talking about filter bubbles and echo chambers that you have just mentioned, what were the most interesting results of your study? And probably they show clearly how all these discussions about living in filter bubbles or echo chambers are actually myths, as we suggested in the title of the talk.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, well, first of all, they really underscore the centrality of search. This search is very important for how people get political information. And you know that one of the major findings we've had since the beginning of the internet, as we've traced it, is that the internet is becoming more and more a place to go, the first place to go for information about anything, almost. Medical, health, entertainment, and politics. It's one of the first places people turn. In terms of politics, it is one of the first places people turn, in addition to the mainstream media, about equally. But they also trust the internet to a large degree. That is, people have a learned level of trust in the internet because they use it and they find what they're looking for. And they begin to realize that, yes, I can find an answer to this question, and I can find competing answers, and I can tweak my search, and I can actually find what I'm looking for online, and so that there's a trust that they can find what they wish to find using the internet. And they trust the internet about as much as they do mainstream media, but they don't have blind faith in the internet. But it's so this main thing was. And I guess it's important to remind ourselves that I was sending email in 1974, and I'd have to call people to tell them, I sent you an email, you'll have to check. And this was before it was widely used. And but even then, there were problems with the internet, and so that the trust in the internet has come a long way since then, but it's one of a diversity of sources. So one of the main findings we had was that while people trust the internet, if you are interested in politics and you have any skill in search, you tend to look at more than 4 different sources for information about politics. If you're interested in sports, you look at multiple media about sports or athletics. You find everything you can. People who are interested in politics do the same thing. They focus on, they look at mainstream media, the internet, social media, and online, they look at multiple online sources. So this is one of the first issues that it was very clear that any single platform study is likely to be somewhat misleading, because even if you were trapped in a filter bubble on Twitter or on Facebook, the likelihood is that you're using multiple media online as well as offline, and you're less likely to be trapped in a single filter bubble across multiple media over time. So that the diversity of sources was perhaps one of the most central findings, and the way that it was driven by most individuals, diversity of sources, but also much more so if you're interested in politics and skilled in search, and most people are. The other thing, a couple of other findings, and we can go back into them, but I think there's a set of findings that mitigate some of the concerns. People also have a repertoire of practices for confirming and checking and verifying what they see online. People don't just blindly accept everything they see online. So especially if people are questioning work or information they see on social media, they often use search to check that information. I attended a session yesterday, I think. Anyway, there was a beautiful discussion of how a news organization verified a video of a few minutes for a major news story, user-generated video, and they verified that it was accurate and it was real, and it only took them 5 hours to do that. Well, the problem is that 100 hours of video were posted online on YouTube alone every minute. So there's a problem of scale here. And so if we're only relying on journalists to verify user-generated video for newscasts, we are seriously in a problem unless users verify and work with trying to understand their own media. So that you see people checking and confirming their information. They also learn new things online. There's serendipity. There's clearly people are looking for information and find other information they weren't looking for. And they also discover information they think is wrong. And check that. They're not lemmings believing everything they read online. They don't censor, or one of the more interesting things was we asked people about Facebook and other social media, whether they drop people from their networks if they don't agree with them on politics and so forth. And it's very rare that people say they do. And if you think about it, most social media networks are based upon other things besides politics. They're friends, workmates, people you went to school with, family and friends. And you don't necessarily create your social media network based upon the political affiliations of individuals. So that in many respects, sometimes their social networks online are more diverse than their real life networks. It's quite amazing. So, and they don't cull those networks because somebody disagrees with them about politics. And they clearly, people are sourcing their own information about politics. So a number of people are, sourcing information and also playing a democratic role in sharing information and sort of the notion of a two-step flow of information that has been a common aspect of politics. Not everybody watches mainstream news, but many of those most interested in politics watch mainstream news and recirculate that information online in addition to through interpersonal influence. So through all those mechanisms, we just determined that there's no need to panic. There are problems, there are proportions of people that might be confused or are uncertain or change their views and be influenced by media, and that's good. But they are not trapped in a filter bubble, not trapped in echo chambers as to the degree that the literature suggests. Those are attractive ideas. They're wonderful ideas. They're intuitively appealing to people that this would explain Brexit, this would explain the Trump election. I don't think so. I think that they're convenient scapegoats, but they are not an explanation of the change in vote, in my opinion. The individual differences, just to remind you, there's no demographic that I could say a particular demographic is the most threatened by echo chambers or filter bubbles. There is a degree to which people who are older, unemployed, less educated are somewhat more likely to be have worse practices online, not as good of search practices, et cetera, and not use as many sources of media. However, that's a very weak correlation, and you find that in every demographic there are people who fall through the cracks and who don't use multiple sources, who don't use good search practices. And we call them the vulnerable, or and I don't know. I don't know what proportion of the public you would guess to be vulnerable to fake news. And Italy had the largest proportion of people that are vulnerable.
How many, in your opinion, a percentage of the population? How many among the vulnerable in Italy, for instance? Try a figure.
Who go to fewer sources of information and have poor search practices, don't know how to use search to check for information, et cetera. 20%.
20, okay. Someone else want to try? 35.
Okay, do I hear? Okay, well, just to keep, Italy was the highest, so I'll tell you, in Italy, 4%. 4. And it is so low because people are, at this time in the world, most people are very interested in politics. So in a way, there's a great deal of interest in politics, and almost everybody has some skill in search. It's amazing to agree that search skills are so well diffused, so that when you take the people who have no search skills and are no interest in politics, a very small proportion of the public fit that category, and therefore a very small proportion are really vulnerable to these problems of fake news and echo chambers, filter bubbles, in my opinion. And, well, according to our data as well, okay?
And since we're playing with numbers, I would like to quote another research paper that was instead published by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford by a research team led by Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, who is also a speaker here at the festival. And they've been analyzing the reach and the public of fake news websites, so websites who are put online with the explicit purpose of publishing fake content to manipulate and influence people. And they've been combining their reach with the reach of the real media, okay? So, for instance, we were panicking in Italy for the potential influence of this website, and they found out that none of the false news websites we considered had an average monthly reach of over 3.5% of the population in 2017. And by comparison, the most popular news website in France, Le Figaro, and in Italy, La Repubblica, had an average monthly reach of 22% and 50.9% respectively. So also in this case, then the empirical evidence of this initial and first studies show a very different reality than what we sometimes read on the headlines or in the journalistic stories. And one very interesting result that came out from your research was also the variety of viewpoints to which users are exposed on the internet, which is related to the points you were raising about echo chambers and filter bubbles. And that's very interesting because we constantly read about the daily me, so the curation of news completely based on our beliefs and biases, etc. And then the empirical evidence shows a completely different reality also in that point.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of the advantage and part of the dream about the internet as a source of political information is that it can overcome some of the limitations of the mainstream media in terms of, certainly in terms of print media, in terms of the number of column inches that could be spent on candidates. How many candidates can you cover? How much coverage can you give to each of the major candidates? And of course, online, this was even in the 80s, we were looking at some of the voter guides that were developed for voters. I mean, you can cover all the candidates and all the issues, presumably. There's no news hole whatsoever. So that the idea of having diversity tremendous diversity of the candidates covered, the issues covered is possible online, where and even in well, even today, in terms of mainstream coverage of politics, it's often less likely that you will have coverage of as much of the long tail of issues and candidates that will not receive as much treatment in mainstream news coverage. So in a way, This is one of the promises, and there are advantages of online news coverage of politics in terms of people who are interested in particular issues, whether it's climate or whatever their particular issue is, that they can find coverage of this online. They know how to use search. They know how to find how a candidate views it, et cetera. So it should support a diversity. Now, the problem is I think there's a real risk that the panic over fake news is going to undermine some of the advantages of the internet in this arena. That already there's a sense, I have a sense that some of the major platforms, including Google and Facebook, are trying to be more conservative in safe. I'm calling it the safe news. So as long as they basically feature safe news, that is the mainstream main stories in the main media outlets, they'll be safe. They won't be accused of disseminating bogus stories or what have you. But in some risk of creating, that's one of the things about the internet, is that you can find very specific stories about about particular issues that are not covered by the mainstream press. So there's a real risk of more homogenization or more homogenation between the mainstream press and the internet coverage of media with that kind of concern over diversity.
And one of the most problematic things about the fake news debate, and I'm sorry for using fake news, a couple years ago here at the festival, there was kind of a moratorium among speakers not to use the term fake news, but I'm just using, imagine it written upside down when I say it. And but what are the risks of this debate, which is mainly done without having a common understanding of what fake news are? So under the umbrella of fake news, we discuss propaganda, we discuss journalistic mistakes, we discuss malicious content published just for the sake of misinformation and so on. But we are trying, or at least policymakers sometimes are trying to solve the problem as if it was one single thing, which it is not. So I see, for instance, and I wonder whether you agree with me, that there has been overreactions and also the proposal of some inappropriate regulation. Like in Italy, for instance, there was a law proposal for making the publication of fake news a felony. And the question would be, who judges if a content is fake or not? Shall we put in jail journalists who make mistakes? Shall we put in jail politicians who do propaganda whatsoever? So what do you see the main risk in having a debate which is not really based on a agreed and shared understanding of what the problem is?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with you. I think the main concern is that in attempting to undermine disinformation, that people will, I mean, who do you want to choose? Who do you want to decide what is fake and what is disingenuous, or what is disinformation versus what is of value to people? And clearly, I think it would be inappropriate to the degree people move towards basically trying to censor or over-regulate in a sense of trying to depress or downgrade news that has any question of its veracity. Sometimes, you know, it's such a complex. Much of these include jokes, right? I mean, jokes. Much of fake news are humor. I mean, being in Italy, you'll know that one of the most prominent fake news stories in the U.S. was that the Pope endorsed Trump. But people, of course, spread it around, and the idea that anybody believed it or that this was influencing votes was ludicrous, but it was a funny sort of fake news meme. And you can imagine people getting worried about distributing that because it's going to be censored or lead to you being labeled as a distributor of fake news. So I think that the other is that there's a certain demonization of the internet now. And
Yeah.
I mean, with this kind of panic over the internet as a source of fake or inappropriate disinformation. Somehow the internet is demonized. And we're doing a survey now. We're actually surveying internet users in the UK now. And I'm expecting that there's going to be a larger, when we say, where do you go first for information? We always ask that, and the internet continually becomes one of the very first places people go in terms of search or social media. And I think that we're going to find a larger proportion of people saying they don't know. They're not sure where they would go first. And I think that's going to be sad, because I think search does work, and search is because it leads you to the information on any media wherever it is. And so this demonization of the internet is going to have a very dysfunctional consequence, I think, on people's access to information generally, potentially. But we'll see when the results of that survey come in. But when I looked at the early percentages of people that were answering our survey, I was somewhat struck by a larger than expected percentage of people who say they don't know where they'd go first. And if that holds up, that's a nightmare scenario for me. The other is that we rely too much on the intermediaries, the platforms, to decide what we should be reading. And that if we rely on the Google and Facebook to become the intermediaries who decide these are the prime stories and this is what you should be reading, they will be acting more and more as newspapers, like newspapers, and editing and selecting, and therefore they will have no argument but to be regulated as if they were a newspaper and be subject to libel and other aspects that other newspapers are. So there's a threat to those platforms, but so be it. They will lose. They will lose to new intermediaries that may come up that are not acting as newspapers, perhaps. But so there are a lot of risk of demonizing the internet and believing too much in the fake news. So, yeah.
I still have a few points I would like to touch with you, but I wonder whether there are questions from the audience. I'm sure you would be happy to answer a question coming from you. So if you have a question, raise your hand. There is a microphone in the room. And yep. Oh.
Hi. Yeah, I got a question. It sounds like the best scenario will be for all of us to have a good media literacy, so that every individual is able to do the best choice in terms of research, so on and so forth. And so I would like to know your thoughts about implementing possibly some media knowledge into the public. I don't know if it's through public education, so on and so forth. And what are your thoughts into this particular topic?
Thank you. I think that's exactly on target. I think what we've referred to is the best approach is not to panic and misregulate the internet, but to nudge you. What I refer to as nudging users in a sense to do the right thing in terms of, first of all, one nudge is for journalists and others is to make sure that people, inspire interest in politics. Interest in politics generates people to look more online and look at more sources. So this is one thing that good journalism can do is raise the interest level in politics by writing interesting stories and interesting aspects of different candidates. The other is to nudge users to look at a diversity of sources, to not rely on a single platform, to check and verify information. So falling out from our study is a whole set of small efforts that could be made to nudge people to do what they already do, but not always well, and could forget nudging users to look at a diversity of sources, check and verify information, don't rely on a single source, et cetera. Look, and that, you know, all the things we know about verifying information in other contexts. And that could be helpful, and and you're not pushing against, you're pushing an open door there in terms of that's what people tend to do anyway, and this is something that could be a very positive outcome.
More questions?
Hi. According to your data, how many people are aware of algorithmic personalization?
I don't know. I don't know that in terms of, but even people I talk to in the internet industry are not really aware of how it works. so how it works. But yes, I think people do know it's personalized. They know that. But yeah, there are degrees in which people are not aware of that, for example. But I mean, you know, the classic was a person asking me, why can't I get directions to go to a certain place? And I said, well, you're not allowing your mobile phone to know where you are. And unless they know where you are, they can't tell you how to get to where you want to go. And you know, you can it's easy to overestimate the knowledge of users, but I think in most cases on the fake news space, people have underestimated users, and they know that localization of information is somehow they're aware of that, but I think generally they're aware that it works, and that personalization works for them, and so. Have you ever tried to personalize? You know, we set up multiple computers, and we tried to pose as candidates, as supporters of Trump, supporters of Clinton, supporters of other candidates, and we tried our best to teach the internet that we were supporting one candidate or another, and we expected that this would lead to, you know. And we really couldn't. The only differences we noticed were the search results. There might be a somewhat different order of options for us, but they were not night and day or colored by that at all.
Hello. Mm-hmm. Sorry, but I have a small criticism on considering filter bubble and echo chamber as a self-contained effect. Like we should see that they are the results of three variables. And if we do not split in these variables, we cannot really understand it and judge it. So in my opinion, they are the production of content. If you have the majority of the people, let's say in Italy, that write content against migrants, it's not a fault of the algorithm or of the people looking for information. It's because the information system is creating information like that. Then there is the platform who has some kind of hidden agenda, algorithms that are not visible for us and not subject to public scrutiny, and that is a different issue. And then the citizen literacy, how much they compel to look at different narratives and what they're looking for. Now, I feel that your methodology was not keeping an account of these variables, but also I have difficulties in seeing them and attribute the proper responsibilities. Did you ever try to look in that direction?
Well, I mean, they use multiple platforms. So if there is a filter bubble, I mean, it would have to be the same across all these platforms, and so that would undermine the tendency for a filter bubble, and people are not usually looking for. They're looking for topics. They are often looking for information about candidates. The kinds of searches they're doing are not such that they're looking. They're trying to find ideologically compatible information. So, and the degree to which people find information they weren't looking for, the way that the skills they have in tweaking their search to if they don't think they're getting to the right place. I just don't see that. If they were, I think your view would be more probable if they were on a single platform using that. But that's not what we're finding. So I think it's less probable. It doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't happen for some people in some cases, but it would be less probable to be an outcome. That's why I think it's a little bit of a panic rather than a real phenomena.
I just wanted to ask, so technology panics are pretty cyclical, and I'm wondering, because you've immersed yourself in looking at people's perspectives and their patterns of use, if you have any ideas, or if you can speak to like the sort of social and cultural implications or reasons that we're fixating on technology rather than like broken institutions, or the very concrete, real ways that people are disassociating from the structures that we used to have faith in to keep things functioning?
Yeah, there are, well, I mean, two points about that. One is, yeah, there are cross-national differences that are very interesting and that have to do with the history of media in different countries. So, for example, in Germany and France and Britain, there is somewhat more trust in mainstream media as compared with the internet. In Italy, Spain, Poland, the United States, there's somewhat more trust in the internet than in Germany, France, and Britain, for example. And this has to do with the history of mainstream media in those countries and problems and so forth. But I think my own suspicion is that the way I ask it is, why are people so fixated on these scapegoats? Why are we blaming algorithms for Trump or for concern over migration or for concern over or the Brexit? And I think it's because people do not want to blame themselves, or so to speak, that actually people genuinely disagree, and people genuinely have competing political beliefs and viewpoints and values, and that it's easier to flag this off to the media or to technology than to serious differences of opinion among the public that are becoming more transparent because of the internet and because of media, and that illuminates preferences of the public. By the way, I mean, I do think that there is, I believe the important algorithm is you. And so that there's no way I'm disagreeing with the point that people have a confirmatory bias. But it is not because of the news, and it's not because of the internet, because people do see a diversity of coverage, they see a diversity of viewpoints, but they choose not to pay attention to a lot of it, so that people will dismiss it or not give it as close a reading, and use media more and focus on more media that confirms their own particular viewpoints. So that, I mean, one of the themes of our work is that you are the major algorithm. That we are the major algorithm, and not the algorithms in the internet and media, because we cannot blame. We are seeing more diversity of viewpoints and information because we use the internet and because we use search and because we look at diverse media sources than we would otherwise. But we still tend to confirm our own prejudices.
To close this, but I would like to ask you one small thing to close the conversation is much of the debates that we have described here have been mainly conducted without a clear base of evidence to base the conversation on. So what is your suggestion in order to have more data, more research, more empirical evidence into the debate? So should we push for having more academics and more researchers involved in the discussion and how to do that. Otherwise, we are going to discuss about opinion rather than on data. You know?
Yeah. Well, it's very hard. I mean, I totally believe in empirical reason. I believe I'm an inductivist. I try to find out what's going on and inductively develop notions that explain what is happening. But I think that there's relatively little empirical research. I think part of it is that survey research and opinion research is sort of out of fashion now because we're so enamored with big data, but inadvertently, a focus on big data does lead to single platform research. So it's easier to get a Facebook data set or a Twitter data set, and that focuses us on what's going on a single platform. And so because we need to do more user-centered research, I think, that goes across platforms. And the other is that we just have to remember that it's not the job of social researchers to just question utopian views. The job of research is to question any conventional viewpoints about what's going on in the world. I mean, and so when we have dystopian views of the internet, it's not like, yes, we finally we have
we got you internet.
We got the internet. But it's now researchers should be questioning any taken for granted assumptions about media in society, whether they're positive or negative or no particular difference. So I think it's having a healthy skepticism about any taken for granted assumptions about the role of the media in politics, and having more user-centered research to complement big data research and platform-centered research.
Bill, many thanks for this conversation. It was great. Many thanks for you for attending. Thanks to the festival, to the people watching us on the internet, again on the internet. And thanks to the technicians and the volunteers. Have a great festival. Bye.